This is a Case 4894 tractor. It's made in 1/64 scale by Ertl. Now this is part of the Prestige collection, so it's got a little bit more detail than what the standard 1/64 scale tractors have. And it is a nice tractor. It looks good sitting on the shelf, but it's actually really disappointing in one particular way. But we'll get into that in a minute. We have a ton of stuff to talk about. So, just sitting on the shelf, it really does display very well. The colors look good, the decals look good. It's got a lot of little details that stick out. Even some of the finer things like the wheel castings are pretty well done. You can see that little windshield on the wiper. Yeah, the lights and the flashers all look pretty good. You can see the caps for the fuel tank and the hydraulic tank there. At least I think that's what they are. I'm not terribly sure. I don't think I've ever seen one of these actually like out in the wild. These weren't terribly common tractors, at least not in my area. Not that they weren't popular. They built these rigid frame tractors for probably 30 years. But anyway, one of the things that kind of stands out is the cab glass. The plastic is sort of frosted over. It's hazy, and it does have some interior details, but you really can't see them because of how hazy the plastic is. I don't know why that is. And I'd imagine it's probably not on all of these tractors, but on this one it is. So that's kind of disappointing. Around here on the back side, you do have a 3-point hitch that's movable, which is really pretty cool. And that's kind of a normal thing for these Prestige collection tractors. It really does make them kind of stand out a little bit on the shelf, and it makes them look pretty good too. Now, this is a rigid frame tractor, and what that means is it doesn't articulate in the center. So there's two types of four-wheel drive tractors. There's either rigid frame or articulating. And as far as I know, Case never built an articulating four-wheel drive tractor. They only built rigid frame. And there's some advantages to that. And like I said, they built them for 30 years. So obviously people saw merit in the rigid frame tractors. That's why they built them. They don't make them anymore. But so where this gets disappointing, as I said, it's a rigid frame tractor and there is no steering on this tractor. And this is fairly recently built, like within the last 2 years Ertl made this model. And I want to point this out, that it's not that they can't make the axle steer, because they certainly can. Alright, so what we have here is a Case 1470 Traction King. This particular model was made probably in the early 2000s. So there's probably a healthy 20-year difference between the 4894 and the 1470 as far as Ertl making the model. Now, what's really important about this is that in the early 2000s, Ertl figured out how to make the axles work to show the rigid frame tractor steering. So it's really disappointing that here 20 years ago, Ertl figured out how to make it work, and they go and they make this nice, highly detailed, rigid frame tractor with no steering. And I can't imagine it would have cost that much more to make it work, but you never know. So it's really interesting to see that Ertl already figured it out. They already knew how to do it and how to make it work. And, I mean, you can just kind of tell just from the detail difference that I'm sure they could make it better. I mean, even if they didn't do anything and just did this exact system as loose as it could be on this tractor, it'd still be great. So, like I said, this is a rigid frame tractor, and when it comes down to the rigid frame steering, you have a couple different modes that you can run the tractor in. You could get it to where it's just the front steered. You could get it to where the front and the rear steered together, or you could do what's called crab steering, where you had both axles turn the same direction. Now, what crab steering would do, when you use both axles steering the same direction, it gets out of your footprint, and it lets you leave less compaction on the ground. It also lets you gain a little bit more traction as well. It's also great on hillsides. And that's where these tractors really stood out, because articulating tractors could not do that. It just wasn't possible. Something else that's interesting is, so with the rigid frame tractors, your rear axle is going to follow in the same path as the front axle when you turn. And you're also going to make a tighter turning circle as well. So that was one of the reasons why these rigid frame tractors stayed in production for as long as they did. They weren't popular with everybody, and they weren't right for every application, but the guys that loved them absolutely loved them. So anyway, this 1470 is probably like late 60s. The 4894, I'm pretty sure it was like 1983, 1984. It was right before Case bought International Harvester. That's why these are white. I think they eventually basically just got painted International red for a while. And, well, we'll get into that. Hold the phone here. All right, so going back to the 50s. At the time, your basic high horsepower tractor from the different manufacturers was about like 65 horsepower. And as the farms increased in acreage, a lot of farmers figured out that if they tied two of their implements together, they could cover a lot more ground a lot faster. But what they also found along with that is if they didn't run out of horsepower, they would run out of traction. So a lot of farmers basically went back to the barn, got their welders out, and started making their own tractors. One of the companies that did that was the Steiger Brothers. Now, they were farmers and they built a tractor to suit their needs, but it stuck out, and a lot of their neighbors and other people that knew them basically wound up saying, hey, we'll pay you, build one of these things for us too. We see what it's doing for you and we want the same thing. So the Steigers basically went from being farmers into tractor manufacturers. Now their style was the articulating tractor that hinged in the center. It worked pretty well for them and it was great, but it didn't work for everyone. Now in 1961, International, they got with Frank Hoff and they built a tractor to compete. It was the 4300, and the thing was just a monster. It was so above and beyond anything else that was out there as far as horsepower and just weight, and there weren't really any implements to work with it, so it didn't do very well. In 1964, Case put out their rigid frame tractor, which was the 1200, which was one series before this, and it did pretty well. So International, 2 years later in 1966, they dropped the 4300 because it was just too big. And they come way down in size, and they build the International 4100, which stayed in production for about 20 years. You know, a bunch of different updates here and there, but the basic rigid frame tractor was around for 20 years almost, maybe 15. Alice Chalmers also put out a rigid frame tractor around that time. It was very short-lived, and eventually they wound up using Steigers to build their tractors, and they just rebadged them as Alice Chalmers. So, basically, that went on for quite a while. International, they kept their 4100 rigid frame tractors, and they also used Steiger to build their articulated tractors and badge them as International. Ford also did the same thing, where they used Steiger tractors, painted them blue, and called them Fords. So, in 1984, Case buys out International. The rigid frame tractors become red. They drop the International four-wheel drive line. They drop the International 2+2s. And in 1985 or 1986, they wind up buying Steiger. So Steiger was still an independent company, but now that Case bought them, they were full-blown red all the time. And in it was 1986 or so, you could get either the red Steiger articulated tractor, or you could get the red rigid frame Case tractor. Now, in 1990, Case and Steiger, they basically redid the articulated tractor line, the Steiger line, and they come up with a new series of tractors. or basically you could get an articulated tractor, or you could get the case tractor. It had a Steiger cab, it had Steiger hood styling, you know, but basically beyond the hood and the cab, it was still a case rigid frame tractor. So for about the next 5 years or so, you could still buy the case rigid frame, or you could buy the traditional Steiger articulated frame four-wheel drive tractor. I'm pretty sure in 1995 they did away with the rigid frame tractors, but it's kind of neat that for that entire time, you know, probably 30 years, you could buy a rigid frame tractor. So it's pretty neat that the idea just made it that long. I don't think there's any rigid frame tractor manufacturers still around today, but they do have their place. And you do still see some of these rigid frame tractors still out there working today. A lot of dairy farms have them. They're great silage tractors. They're great for doing like slurry. And they're handy on grain carts too. They certainly have their place. They're pretty cheap to buy as far as I understand. And, well, when you just need cheap horsepower and traction, it's hard to beat a rigid frame, in all honesty. So anyway, I tried to explain it, how we got to where we are. Try to make it not terribly confusing. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Let me know. I always like learning about this kind of stuff. I find it interesting. It's neat to see the history of these tractors and see how we got to where we are. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more of what I got, please subscribe to Maryland Construction Diecast. Thanks for watching.